Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we're diving into a really profound, almost existential struggle. We're looking at the journey of a massive intellectual figure who wrestled with the very foundations of faith. This is a man who admitted that if you just look at the harsh realities of human history, at all the suffering, he would have been an atheist, or maybe a pantheist. But he couldn't because of this one undeniable certainty he found in his own conscience. We're talking about Cardinal John Henry Newman and his story, chronicled in his book Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which he wrote in 1864. It's his defense, sure, but it's really his search for an objective, lasting truth in a world that just felt like it was spiraling into skepticism and chaos.
And that's the hook right there. The stakes for him are just cosmic. This isn't just about changing churches. For Newman, this was an intellectual emergency. He had two facts that just couldn't exist together. On one hand, this deep inner certainty of a moral, divine creator.
Right, and his conscience.
Exactly. And on the other, he looks out at the world and sees what looks like total rebellion and abandonment. So the Apologia is his quest to find an authority, an objective truth, strong enough to bridge that massive gap.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start with the man himself, John Henry Newman, and the world he was living in when he wrote this.
Well, he was born in London, 1801, and the sources point out something interesting, this foreign strain in his background. His father was Dutch, his mother was descended from French Huguenots.
So maybe he had a perspective that wasn't purely, insularly English.
It's possible, and by the time he's writing this in 1864, he's already a huge public figure. He's been a spiritual leader for over 30 years, and his entire career really was built at Oxford.
At Oriel College, which was the intellectual hub at the time.
An absolute center. It was the home of what was known as the liberal set.
Ah, the noetics. I remember that term.
Exactly. Old Oxford called them the noetics, as an insult, basically meaning these guys who thought private reason was more important than tradition. And Newman was part of that at first. But then his friendships with figures like John Keble and Edward Pusey pulled him in a different direction.
Towards what became the Oxford movement.
Yes, from about 1826 to 1833. This was a huge deal. It was a movement to, you could say, re-Catholicize the Anglican Church from the inside.
Emphasizing its ancient roots, the sacraments, apostolic succession, all of that.
All of it. They were pushing back against the state controlling the church. And Newman became the intellectual engine of the whole thing, which, of course, is why his conversion to Catholicism in 1845 was such a bombshell.
And that bombshell is what leads directly to the Apologia. It was, an emergency defense of his own character.
It was an all-out war for his reputation. The trigger was a public and, frankly, vicious attack from a very popular novelist and Anglican clergyman, Charles Kingsley.
And what was the charge?
Kingsley didn't just disagree with him. He accused Newman of being a crafty, scheming man, simply untrustworthy.
Wow. That's not a theological debate. That's a direct shot at his integrity.
It's worse. Kingsley's accusation was that Newman had been a secret Catholic the whole time he was an Anglican leader. He was basically saying Newman was the living embodiment of this English stereotype of the dishonest Roman casuist who thinks truth is just a tool to be manipulated.
So in the public mind, Newman becomes the test case for whether any Catholic priest can be trusted.
Precisely. The entire Catholic faith was on trial through him. But Newman's response is incredible. He looks at Kingsley and says, essentially, that this view is the closest Kingsley is intellectually capable of getting to the truth.
That's amazing. He's not saying Kingsley is evil. He's saying he's intellectually limited.
It's a masterstroke.
Yeah.
He sidesteps the accusation of malice entirely. And he realized that the attack wasn't really about him. He was just the representative. The real target was the Catholic religion itself.
So a simple denial wouldn't work.
No. He had to lay it all bare. He had to show every single step of his journey, every influence, every doubt.
He had to prove that his beliefs grew out of Protestant books, Protestant friends, and his own mind, not from some secret Roman conspiracy. He had to explain why he left, as he put it, my kindred and my father's house.
And that's what the Apologia is. It's a forensic, intellectual autobiography. It's proof of his integrity because the path he lays out is so agonizing and intellectually necessary that it couldn't possibly be the result of a secret plot.
So let's get into that architecture then, because from the very beginning, his intellectual life is just full of these deep contradictions.
It really is. He says he had no formed religious ideas until he was 15.
Yeah.
But in 1816, something clicks.
Yeah.
And it plants what he calls an intellectual inconsistency that would basically drive him for the next 30 years.
And that first click was Calvinism.
Yes, the Calvinist school. He reads Romaine and Thomas Scott, and this embeds two huge principles in his mind. First, holiness before peace.
So no easy grace.
None. And second, growth is the only evidence of life. So a very rigorous, very demanding moral foundation is laid down right at the start.
Okay, so that's one pull, this austere moral seriousness. But at the same time, he's reading things that pull him in completely opposite directions.
Exactly. He's reading Milner's church history, and he says he becomes enamored with St. Augustine and the early church fathers. He falls in love with the history, the dogma, the reality of the ancient unified church.
But the contradiction is?
The contradiction is that at the exact same time, he's reading Newton on the prophecies, which convinces him, in his words, most firmly that the Pope was the Antichrist.
I mean, how do you even function with that? You adore the ancient faith, but you think the living head of that tradition is literally the agent of Satan.
That's the tension. That high wire act is the engine of his entire life's work. How do you revere the roots of the tree while being convinced the main trunk is demonic? It's an impossible position.
So his time at Oxford must have been where he started to get the tools to even try and solve that puzzle. Who were the key people there?
You can trace a pretty clear line. First, there was a Dr. Hawkins. Hawkins taught him to be incredibly precise with his words, and, crucially, to question inherited beliefs. He's the one who introduces Newman to the doctrine of tradition, making him think about how we know what we know.
So that's a big step away from just accepting a set of rules. The authority itself becomes the subject of the investigation.
A huge step. Then comes Dr. Whately, who Newman says taught him to think for myself. And Whately's big contribution was the idea of the church as a substantive body or corporation.
Meaning not just an abstract spiritual idea, but a real, tangible institution in the world.
Yes, a real body with real power separate from the state. And that changes everything, because if the church is a real corporation, then the question becomes, which one is the true one?
Right, and that leads to his immediate circle, with Keble and Froude.
Exactly. Keble gives him this sort of moral and poetic framework, but Hurrell Froude is the real catalyst. Froude was what he called a bold writer. He pushed ideas to their absolute limit, and his number one enemy was Erastianism.
Okay, let's pause on that word, because it's so important for understanding why they felt such urgency. What exactly is Erastianism in this context?
Simply put, it's the idea that the state is supreme over the church. In 19th century England, the Anglican Church was the state church. Its bishops were appointed by the government. Its rules could be changed by Parliament.
And Froude saw this as the great enemy.
He saw it as the primary tool of liberalism. Because if Parliament, which is becoming more and more secular, can vote on church doctrine, well, then Christian truth can just be legislated away. For Froude, the link between church and state had to be snapped, or dogma would always be in danger from rationalist attacks.
Which explains why some of the later political events were so devastating for Newman. Froude basically predicted it.
He did. So you have all these pieces in place. And it leads Newman to one of his most important philosophical ideas, which is about the nature of certitude.
This is where he starts to push back against the purely rationalist approach to faith.
Totally. He sees that you can't just use a simple logical syllogism to arrive at a deep personal conviction. You might prove God exists on paper, but feel nothing.
So what's his alternative?
He argues that real certitude, the kind you feel deep in your bones, is the result of an assemblage of concurring and converging probabilities.
Okay, that's a fascinating phrase. So it's not one big, solid pillar of proof.
No, it's more like 100 small threads woven into an unbreakable rope. No single piece of evidence, history, personal experience, moral intuition, the beauty of the system is enough on its own. But when they all converge, they create a mental weight that is as strong as any scientific proof.
He makes a distinction then between certitude and certainty.
A crucial one. Certainty is a quality of a proposition. It's objective. A triangle has three sides. That's certain.
But certitude?
Certitude is a habit of mind. It's subjective. It's what you feel. And he argues that this convergence of probabilities can create a mental certitude that is equal in force to logical certainty.
This is so important, because it means his entire defense of his faith rests on this idea that his deepest convictions are a justified but not purely logical commitment.
Yes, it's an act of the whole mind, not just the reasoning part. And for him, that establishes the ultimate authority he will return to again and again, the self-authenticating voice of his own conscience.
So with those tools in hand, the battle lines are drawn. And for Newman, the primary enemy, the great threat, is liberalism.
And we have to be clear, when he says liberalism, he doesn't mean a political party. He means the intellectual trend that grew out of the French Revolution, Rationalism, skepticism, the idea that objective truth doesn't exist, only private opinions.
To for him, this was a life-or-death struggle for the very idea of religious reality.
It was. He saw the future as a stern encounter between two and only two principles: Catholic truth and rationalism. There was no middle ground. In fact, he even said the word Protestant was a problem because it didn't profess anything. It was just a protest against something, which meant it could be compatible with total unbelief.
And this urgency is what pushes him to try and build a coherent system within Anglicanism, the famous via media.
The middle way. This was his grand project from about 1834 to 1836. He was trying to prove that Anglicanism wasn't just watery Protestantism, but that it was the true, authentic, ancient Christianity, perfectly positioned between the errors of Rome on one side and the chaos of popular Protestantism on the other.
So what was this middle way built on?
He built it on the fundamentals he believed were shared with the ancient church: the Trinity, the Incarnation, sacramental grace, apostolic succession. He wanted to show that you could hold all these deeply Catholic truths while still rejecting what he saw as Rome's unjust claims to universal power.
So he's not inventing something new. He's trying to excavate what he thinks is already there.
Exactly. He's digging through the great Anglican theologians of the 17th century, people like Laud and Andrews, trying to piece together a coherent system they all pointed to. He believed if he could just assemble it, the true Catholic nature of the Anglican Church would be revealed.
But there was a massive flaw in the plan, one he later admitted himself.
A fatal flaw. His own devastating conclusion was that the Via Media was a paper religion.
A paper religion? What does that even mean?
It means it looked beautiful in books, it was intellectually elegant, but it had no real existence in the world. He said, Protestantism and popery are real religions, but the Via Media has scarcely had existence except on paper.
But why? If he had all these great theologians backing him up, why wasn't it real?
Because those theologians spoke for themselves as individuals. The Church of England, as an institution as a whole, had never officially adopted their system. Its founding documents, like the 39 Articles, were deliberately written to be ambiguous.
To keep everyone under one roof, from Calvinists to high churchmen?
Precisely. So Newman was trying to force a rigid, coherent system onto a structure that was designed to be flexible. He was interpreting everything in the most Catholic sense possible, and that was bound to cause a reaction.
Which it did with the huge controversy over Tract 90.
Oh, the explosion over Tract 90 in 1841. This was his attempt to argue that the 39 Articles weren't attacking core Catholic dogmas, just popular abuses and opinions. The backlash was so intense he was condemned as a traitor. His career as an Anglican leader was effectively over, even though he was years away from converting. The intellectual ground was already collapsing beneath him.
And that collapse gets finalized by two huge intellectual hammer blows. The first one came in 1839 while he was studying the Monophysites.
Yes, a 5th century heresy. It's a perfect example of how studying history can trigger a modern existential crisis. The Monophysites believed Christ had only one nature, the divine one.
So why did reading about this ancient fight throw Newman into a crisis?
Because he saw a terrifying parallel. In the 5th century, you had the mainstream universal church centered in Rome fighting against a breakaway group, the Monophysites, who claimed they were the ones holding to the true ancient faith.
And Newman realized.
He realized that the arguments the ancient popes used to condemn the Monophysites as heretics were the exact same arguments that could be used against the Anglicans who broke away from Rome in the 16th century.
It's the same drama, just with different actors.
The drama of religion, he said, was ever one and the same. He saw Rome in the 5th century acting just like Rome in the 16th, defending dogma and unity against a faction that was relying on its own judgment.
And then came the single phrase that just blew the whole thing apart.
The intellectual atom bomb. A friend points him to an article about another ancient schism, and in it is a quote from St. Augustine. The words, he said, struck him with a power he'd never felt from any words before. Securus judicat orbis terrarum.
The world's verdict is decisive, or the whole world judges, surely.
And it was decisive because it cut through all the complex arguments about antiquity that the Anglicans relied on. It set up a much simpler rule. The deliberate judgment in which the whole church eventually rests is the infallible sentence against any small part that breaks away.
The implication for Anglicanism is just catastrophic.
It's the end of the game. If the vast majority of the Christian world for centuries has rested in a judgment that condemns a breakaway group, then that judgment stands. And he saw that if it applied to the Donatists and the Monophysites, it had to apply to the Church of England.
So his whole theory, his whole career was just pulverized by one sentence from a 4th century saint.
He said he felt the shadow of a hand upon the wall. He knew, in that moment, the Church of Rome will be found right after all. The intellectual structure of the Via Media was gone. It was shattered.
And if that historical shock wasn't enough, the political one came 2 years later in 1841 with the Jerusalem bishopric scandal.
This was the moment that proved Froude's worst fears about Erastianism were true.
Yeah.
The plan was cooked up by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prussian court to create an Anglican bishop in Jerusalem.
Which sounds fine on the surface, but it was really a political move.
It was pure geopolitics, a way for Britain to have influence in the region to counter Catholic France and Orthodox Russia. But the problem was how they did it.
What was the catch?
The new bishop was told to cooperate with heretical groups like Nestorians and Monophysites. Worse, he was to accept European Protestants like Lutherans, who signed the Augsburg Confession into communion without them having to renounce any of their beliefs.
So wait, for Newman, who's fighting for the absolute necessity of apostolic doctrine and sacramental grace, this is a total betrayal.
It was dogmatic suicide. The Anglican Church was officially recognizing heresy and watering down its own faith, all for the sake of a political alliance.
It was choosing expediency over truth.
It was the ultimate proof for him that the Anglican Church did not see itself as a guardian of objective dogmatic truth. It was the ultimate condemnation of the old theory of the Via Media.
So at that point, his mind is made up.
Intellectually, yes, the Anglican Church had lost its claim on him. He still had emotional ties and some lingering objections to Rome, but the foundation of his old life was completely gone.
So now we have this clear, painful intellectual journey. But as you said, this was all happening while he was being publicly accused of being a liar. Kingsley was attacking him based on these Catholic ideas of economy and casuistry.
Yes, and that fear of Roman casuistry was so powerful in Victorian England. The idea that priests had a secret rule book that allowed them to lie to good, honest Protestants. Kingsley painted Newman as the master of this dark art.
So Newman has to stop everything and defend his basic personal honesty.
He does, and his flat denial is maybe the most powerful part of the book. He just says, I scorn and detest lying and quibbling and double-tongued practice and slyness and cunning. He's drawing a line in the sand. Whatever the theology says, my rule is honesty.
But he still has to explain this concept of economy that Kingsley is using as a weapon. How does he define it?
He argues it's not about lying. He says economy means three things. One, you can conceal a truth without being deceitful, like not telling a child a complex or frightening fact. Two, you can state a truth partially. And three, you can represent it in the nearest form possible for a learner.
Like drawing an angel with wings. We know they aren't birds, but it's a representation that helps us understand.
That's a perfect example. The early Christians practiced economy when they hid the full details of the Eucharist from pagans. They were being silent to protect a mystery, not telling a falsehood.
So Kingsley is just confusing concealment with active deception.
That's Newman's whole point.
Yeah.
And then he does something brilliant. He flips the entire argument back on his critics. He shows that this isn't some uniquely Catholic problem. He quotes the great Protestant poet John Milton, who basically asks, who wouldn't deceive a madman or a thief for the greater good?
Right, he's showing that even Protestant heroes acknowledge that absolute literal truth-telling isn't always possible or right.
Exactly. And then he quotes the Protestant ethicist William Paley, who flat out says there are falsehoods, which are not lies, that is, which are not criminal. Newman's point is devastating. If you're going to condemn Catholic priests for this, you had to condemn your own intellectual giants, too.
He's showing that the complexity is in the world, not just in one church.
Yes. And he says the ultimate authority on this isn't some dusty book of rules anyway, it's conscience. He says moral law is referred to the moral sense, which is the natural possession of us all. That's his rock.
Which brings us right back to the core existential struggle of the book. This tension between his inner certainty, his conscience, and the chaos he sees in the world.
This is the absolute heart of it. This is where he confronts the possibility of atheism head-on. He starts with a foundational claim. The existence of God is as certain to him as his own existence.
And not because of some logical proof.
No, he says those arguments from nature don't warm me or enlighten me. It's a primary truth, a direct intuition from the voice, speaking so clearly in my conscience and my heart.
So his belief is anchored entirely in that internal moral reality. But then he looks out at the world.
And what he sees fills him with unspeakable distress. He sees human history as a catalog of failure, of sin, of the success of evil, a dreary, hopeless irreligion.
He sees the problem of evil, but on a cosmic scale.
It's so profound that he says the sight of the world simply gives the lie to that great truth he finds in his heart. The conflict is so sharp, it's as if the world is denying his own existence. It's a crisis that threatens to tear his mind apart.
He's standing right on the edge of the abyss. And what's the logical conclusion from that dilemma?
He spells it out. Either there is no creator, or this living society of men is in a true sense discarded from his presence. He says without some kind of divine intervention, some guide, he would have no choice but to be an atheist, a pantheist, or a polytheist.
So the search for an objective authority is born directly from staring atheism in the face.
It is. The problem of evil is so immense, it demands a solution more powerful than private opinion. And so, he argues, if God is going to interfere in this broken world, a revelation, a guide, is logically necessary. And the claim of the Catholic Church to infallibility is the perfect answer to that existential need.
That's a radical claim. Infallibility isn't some theological add-on. It's a philosophical necessity to avoid atheism.
For him, it's an act of divine mercy. He calls it a provision to preserve religion in the world and to restrain that freedom of thought, and to rescue it from its own suicidal excesses.
Suicidal excesses, that's incredible language. So an infallible authority is like a guardrail for the human intellect to stop it from reasoning itself into oblivion.
That's it, exactly. In an age of rationalism where every fixed truth is being dissolved by skepticism, an infallible dogmatic authority is the only thing that can protect the core of the faith. It explains why the world is broken by sin, and it provides the path to redemption.
But he still has to deal with the common objection that infallibility is just intellectual slavery.
Right, and he argues that it's actually the opposite. He says infallibility is very constrained. It can't invent new things. It has to stay within the bounds of scripture, tradition, and the moral law. It's a guardian of old truths, not a factory for new ones.
So instead of shutting down thought, having that fixed center actually liberates it.
That's his argument. Once the core dogmas are secure, the theologian has the liberty, but to the courage, to explore and acquire, without the fear that they're going to accidentally destroy the foundation of everything. It provides a secure base from which to operate.
So by 1844, the intellectual battle is over for him. But the final act, the actual departure, was still a slow and agonizing process.
Deeply agonizing. He knew that if truth was a real objective thing, he had an act. To stay in a system he now believed was wrong would be the ultimate betrayal of the very principle he'd fought for his whole life.
He resigns from St. Mary's in 1843, but he stresses that this final step has to be a personal one.
Yes, that was so important to him. He couldn't be converted in partnership. He felt his own soul was his first concern. It had to be a solitary act between him and God, not the head of a movement leading his followers over a bridge.
He leaves Oxford for good in February 1846, and it's a total break.
A complete and painful separation. The sources say he felt the words, "Forget thy people and thy father's house." It was an exile. He said he never saw Oxford again, except for its spires from the railway.
And what was the result? Once he finally made the move, what did he feel?
Peace and clarity. He said for the first time he saw the Anglican Church from the outside and saw it for what it was, not a mystical ancient church, but a mere national institution. It lacked the reality he had been searching for.
That word again, reality.
It's the key to everything. In contrast, he said the Catholic Church was a reality where his mind could finally rest in relaxation and in peace. The struggle was over. He had found the objective authority that could finally reconcile the God and his conscience with the chaos in the world.
So, to wrap this all up, Newman's entire journey is framed by this incredible tension. He has two absolute certainties: the voice of God inside him and the evidence of sin and chaos outside him.
And that tension puts him on the razor's edge of atheism. His whole intellectual quest was to find something, some authority, that could hold those two realities together without breaking. And for him, that could only be an infallible authority.
Not as some kind of tyranny, but as a necessary mercy. The only coherent answer to the problem of evil and what he called the suicidal excesses of a mind left entirely to its own devices.
It brings you back to the choice he laid out way back in 1841. He said that people who read and think can't just stand in the middle, the channel of no meaning, forever.
They have to choose a consistent view.
It has to be a real view. Liberalism, popery, whatever, but it will be real. And his own certainty didn't come from one single proof, but from all those converging probabilities. It leads to a final question for us, I think.
What's that?
In our own lives, with this constant overload of information and competing truths, we're always tempted to stay in that comfortable channel of no meaning. But is real intellectual growth, maybe real spiritual growth, dependent on making a venture towards a belief that feels real? even if, as Newman says, we can't prove it in mood and figure. Is avoiding that choice in the end a kind of denial of truth itself?